listening to Allman in the Morning. Common Sense Radio.
Steve says Scott Pelley clearly doesn't understand what the death tax is. Because if you can be a multi-million-dollar CBS News anchor and you call the death tax a tax break for the dead, you're an idiot. I'm sorry, but you're an idiot. And also, one more thing for you, Scott Pelley. You're not 31 years old. You're 59 years old. Dressing up in a blue suit and brown shoes to look like you just came out of GQ as a 31-year-old, you're an old man. Okay? Your skinny suit and your brown shoes doesn't work.
We don't like it.
Just saying. Chris Wallace, we'll catch him, dude. Chris Wallace, I know that you're too much of a polite and courteous man to just wantonly attack your colleagues in the media. But I will have to tell you, though, it is to call the death tax a tax break for the dead really is a bozo move, right?
Well, I don't know about that. I will say this, and this is all you're going to get me to say. I do watch the CBS Evening News, and if you were to watch the first 30 seconds of last night's show, and I watch it routinely because I like to watch one of the mainstream newscasts in addition to Special Report to get a kind of GPS sense of what's going on by looking at different networks. If you were to watch the first 30 seconds of copy last night on the CBS Evening News, that didn't, by my standards, meet any sense of objectivity and fairness.
No.
It was an editorial.
Right. I just played it before the break, before we got to you, and so yeah, it clearly was. And I know that Mr. Pelley has been revered by the New York Times, or somebody did a profile of him, lauding him for his opinion journalism, and so maybe he's kind of taking that to another level. But still, that was interesting.
Here's the bottom line, and I really mean this. Look, I can understand people being upset with Donald Trump. I can understand people being especially upset, reporters, with the way he's attacked the media. And you know, I will always remember when he called the American press the enemy of the American people, which I think was an outrage, one of the low points of the first 100 days. Having said that, that doesn't affect how we do our job. We have to be fair. We have to be objective. We cannot let our opinions seep into what is our news coverage. And, you know, even if you don't like what he does, that shouldn't affect the way we do our job.
That's true. I do happen to believe some people are the enemies of the people in the media. Maybe not all of the media. But I will say,
let me tell you, to me, this is as strong as it gets. I did an interview with Bill McRaven, who was a rear admiral. He was the head of U.S. Special Operations Command. He was the guy in charge of capturing Saddam Hussein. He was the guy in charge of the takedown of bin Laden. He was the guy in charge of rescuing Captain Phillips. This guy is more of a patriot and has served his country more than anybody I can imagine. And he said that he thought that was one of the greatest threats to democracy, that statement that he'd ever heard. And I agree with him. And let me tell you, whether you agree with it doesn't matter what I think. If Bill McRaven says something is anti-democratic, calling the media the enemy of the American people, I take it really seriously. And all of your listeners should too. And I'm sure some of them are out there saying, oh, yeah, but we are a democracy because we have a free press. And yes, you want it to be fair, and yes, you want it to be objective, but it has to be free. And to say that a free press is an enemy of the American people doesn't understand what the Constitution is all about.
I know, but he didn't say a free press is the enemy of the people.
He said, he listed almost every news organization, the New York Times, CBS, CNN, ABC, NBC. That's broad enough for me.
Come on, you should throw your other people under the bus. He didn't mention you. It's good. I'm just kidding.
You know, I'm really, I don't even know.
I know you're serious about I
this,
know.
But here's the point. We got to stand up for each other. During the Obama administration, they tried to marginalize us and single us out from the herd and take us down. And one of the things that I will always remember proudly is that the other networks stood up for us. I don't think all of them agreed with us, but they said, it isn't the job of the White House, any White House, liberal White House to conservative press, conservative White House to, quote, liberal press. It isn't the job of a White House to try to marginalize and take down somebody in the media. And, the day you sit there and say, well, okay, it's fine for Donald Trump to take out the New York Times, then it's going to be Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton or Elizabeth Warren saying, let's take out Fox, or, let's take out the Wall Street Journal. That gets very dangerous.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to, some people, they're only human, and when you've experienced people who were dedicated to taking you out, you tend to have a little bit of a raw feeling. I understand that a lot of us should be better than that. I get that, but I think some of that comes from some raw emotion.
The president can't afford to have raw emotion.
Yeah.
The people's lives are at stake. I'm not saying in this case they're not, but a president can't afford to have raw emotion. He can't afford to shoot off his mouth.
Well, I think sometimes that could be true. But I think, honestly, some of these people are just simply reporting things like gratuitously. Every day you see a story, like, for instance, Ivanka Trump is the one who ordered the Syria bombing. That's irresponsible. That just is. I agree.
Look, don't get me wrong. Do I think Donald Trump is being treated fairly by the mainstream media? Absolutely not. As I just pointed out, I think there are cases of egregious bias, egregious unfairness by the media in its treatment, some of the media in their treatment of President Trump and his administration. But having said that, as far as we're concerned, we have to do our job fairly and should be held to certain standards, and frankly, the president should be too. And, to sit there, it's one thing, look, if Donald Trump wants to complain and say that story was a hit job, I have no problem with that, and I don't think that's, we fire at them, they can fire back at us. I don't have any problem with that. But when you start talking about enemy of the American people, that takes it to a different level.
Yeah, I think, too, in many ways, and listen, you get grief both ways, and that's a good thing, I think, in terms of how you operate. You're kind of like, when people watch like a playoff game, they always think the announcer is against their team.
Right.
And you probably get a lot of that, because I do believe, as I've always said before, that you are the most fair. I think even on Fox News, to tell you the truth, and you're always going to get criticism for that.
But I appreciate that, and you're right. I do get criticism, and I'll get it. For the same interview, I'll get people saying you're doing a hit job on Trump, and other people saying you're at the same interview you're in the tank to Trump. So. But in the end, and this goes back to what I say about our job isn't to be popular. Our job isn't to please the emailers. Our job isn't to please an opinion columnist in the New York Times who may say, oh, boy, he's really quite great. I see that now with people who are taking shots at Trump in the mainstream or liberal media, and, they're getting praised for it. You shouldn't get praised for that, and you shouldn't do it. Even if you are getting praise, do your job. Just treat them fairly, and even if they're treating you unfairly, treat them fairly.
Yeah, and especially it's really weird to see someone like Scott Pelley, who, man, this guy's been around the block, and it seems like that's almost a deterioration of the CBS News product to have an anchor who really is clearly biased. This was just something I was shocked to see that. Although maybe not should have. But anyway, we'll move on to the tax plan. What's your take on that, and how do you think this whole thing's going to go?
Well, look, I like the idea. Everybody likes the idea of cutting taxes, and I like the idea of tax reform, which is lower rates but take out some of the deductions. What I don't like is the idea of blowing a hole in the deficit. We're almost $20 trillion in debt, and there's talk that some of the elements of this could add another $5 trillion to the debt, and we can't afford that. We don't want to turn into Greece or one of these other countries that becomes a huge debtor nation. And when Reagan and Bill Bradley, a truly bipartisan bill, I remember I covered it in 1986, the last major tax reform. And tax reform has always meant you lower rates, but you eliminate a lot of the deductions and a lot of the loopholes. And if you were to do that in a way that it was revenue neutral or close to revenue neutral, I'd be all for it. But when I see the Secretary of the Treasury talking about, well, we're going to do this through dynamic scoring. What dynamic scoring means, the numbers aren't going to add up. The numbers are going to add up that we're going to lose $5 trillion in revenue, add another $5 trillion, go from 20 to 25 trillion in our national debt. But we think we're going to grow our way out of it. This is the so-called supply-side economics of Ronald Reagan back in the early 80s, and it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. You can look at it in 1982, whenever it was, with Reagan. You can look at it with 2001 and 2003 with George W. Bush. And yes, it will stimulate some growth, and that's a good thing, although not always as much as people think it will. But it never pays for itself. If you lose $100 million in revenue, you're not going to get $150 million in growth. It just doesn't happen. And I don't think that what we need to do at this point is add to our debt.
What happens if you cut spending and along the lines of at the same time that you're doing the tax relief? And I realize, too, you're probably going to hear, if you talk about this on your show, somebody on your show will say, well, we can grow our way to revenue neutrality, meaning...
Yeah, but you can't. I'd like somebody to point out the time it happened. As I just said, you can't cut $100 million in revenue and get $150 million or even $100 million in economic growth. It just has never happened. Now, you just brought up a really good point, which is a grand bargain. And a lot of people have been talking about this for a long time. And do you remember something called the Bowles-Simpson Commission that Barack Obama was in favor of? And the idea there was, let's take everything. Let's take taxes. Let's take spending. Let's take entitlement reform. And let's put it all, because it's all money. It's money in or money out. And put it all, and let's do some grand bargain that would save entitlements, prevent them from going bankrupt. And they are going to go bankrupt at the current system, and particularly with all of these baby boomers, that are going to be retiring and are going to be a net drag on the economy instead of a net plus for the economy. I hate to say that about you and me, Jamie, but we are going to be a drag. Some would say you already are a drag. But in any case, do all of that. And they came up with a plan, and it really had some legs, and Obama ducked it. He refused to sign on to it, and so it died. But if you were to do that, I'd be all for that. I mean, let's just do a grand bargain, and if he were to do that, Donald Trump, he'd be one of the great presidents in history.
Well, and I've always thought that ultimately, if you, like, for instance, starting with cutting food stamps is not the way to go. If you actually started to look at some hard choices you're making in terms of the money we're spending or the giveaways we're giving to people who ultimately don't really need it, I'm talking about corporate welfare, that kind of stuff, then you'd have money to take care of the people who truly do need it. We have a situation here in Missouri where, we've got a few $100 million in terms of some tax breaks that we're giving to corporations and everything else, and then we have turned around and cut a renter's tax credit for the elderly. It's like, okay, you could keep the renter's tax credit for the elderly if you would just stop sucking up to the corporate welfare people. I
agree. I mean, somebody has to sit there and say, and obviously they're picking winners and losers.
Yes.
That's always the tough thing, but obviously there are some that make more sense. And let's talk about the death tax, which is not it's not a tax or break for the dead. but I don't know how many people know this. My folks, my mother and dad both died, and so I've been through the death tax fairly recently. There is an exemption on the death tax on, I think it's the first $5 million or so. So what percentage of people leave an estate of $5 million? Not many. It's a very, very, very small percentage of people. There are people who do, but a lot of people don't leave $5 million. If you leave an estate of $5 million or $4.9 million, you know how much the death tax is now? Zero. It's exempt. So, so the only people who are affected by the death tax are the inheritors of estates of more than $5 million. you can argue maybe it should be lower. Yes, you don't want to see the family farm have to be given up. But I don't know that I think that when you're looking at all the ways or all the tax breaks that need to be done, or all the taxes that need to be done away with, I'm not sure a tax on estates of more than $5 million should be tax-free.
Yeah.
I'm just... Do you?
No, I didn't actually know that. So that's interesting. You point that out.
People don't know that, but the first $5 million. So let me just say, folks, if you have a net worth of less than $5 million, don't hold me to the exact number, but it's 4.5, 5.5. It's right around $5 million. There's no death tax as it is. So we're here talking about people who have death tax estates of $10 million or $20 million.
Right, but I'm not
sure that should go untaxed.
Well, why? I mean, why should anybody? I think the death tax ought to be cleared for everybody, no matter what the amount is. Why would
because it's exactly what you say. You could argue, well, all right, it's not good to have the crony capital, but you do have to raise money. And if you have a choice between having a death tax, maybe you want to raise the level from $5 million to $7 million or whatever. But I'd rather see people, estates of $7 million, have some tax. You could argue it's too high, but have some tax, than have the renters' tax break that you were just talking about for elderly people or poor people eliminated.
But we can make some
choices.
Right, we can make some other choices beyond that. These people already paid taxes, though. That's the problem.
I understand that.
Yeah,
I understand, but you got to find the money somewhere. You can take out everything. I mean. It's like let's just have dessert. We're not going to do any vegetables. If you're going to eliminate all of those taxes, you're going to have to do something.
All right. Well, we will be watching no matter what, because I know that lots of things happen, especially in this environment now, between now and Sunday.
Yeah, right. Will indeed.
All right, friend. Well, we'll be tuning in at Fox News Sunday on Twitter, and, of course, we'll see you then.
Thank you.
Thank you, as always. That is Chris Wallace, people.